I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Just when the royal family appeared united behind closed doors, a secret legal move threatened to tear everything apart. According to explosive palace insiders, Queen Camilla quietly launched a challenge that could have altered the future of King Charles's final wishes forever. But before the challenge could reach its destination, one royal stepped directly into its path. Princess Anne's response was swift, calculated, and devastating, and what happened next sent shockwaves through every corner of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For months, the public had been led to believe that stability had finally returned to the royal household. The turbulence, the rivalries, and the whispers of division seemed to have faded into the background. Yet beneath that carefully maintained image, a storm was gathering. It began with rumors circulating among a small circle of trusted palace figures. At first, those whispers were dismissed as speculation. But as more fragments of information surfaced, a troubling picture started to emerge. Somewhere within the royal establishment, a confidential legal challenge connected to King Charles's will was quietly taking shape, and the implications were enormous. The first signs reportedly appeared when palace aides noticed unusual activity surrounding highly sensitive royal documents. Requests were being made. Records were being reviewed. Conversations that normally would have passed unnoticed suddenly attracted attention. Those closest to the situation allegedly became concerned that someone was attempting to revisit decisions that had already been settled. The deeper they looked, the more they realized that this was not routine administrative work. Something far more significant was unfolding behind closed doors, hidden from public view and shielded by layers of discretion. According to insiders, the center of the controversy was Queen Camilla herself. Sources claimed that she believed certain provisions contained within Charles's final arrangements unfairly limited her future influence inside the monarchy. Whether motivated by concern, frustration, or a desire to protect her own position, she reportedly began exploring avenues that could alter the outcome. What may have started as private dissatisfaction soon evolved into something much larger. The possibility that Charles' carefully constructed legacy could be challenged sent waves of concern through senior royal circles, where loyalty to the king's wishes remained a deeply emotional issue. As word spread among trusted advisors, quiet alarm quickly turned into urgent preparation. Constitutional experts, legal consultants, and senior palace figures allegedly began discussing scenarios that only weeks earlier would have seemed unthinkable. Some feared that even a limited challenge could trigger a crisis capable of exposing private royal disagreements to the world. Others worried that the dispute might create dangerous uncertainty about the future direction of the crown itself. Behind every conversation was the same unsettling question. If Charles's final wishes could be contested, what else might be vulnerable? Then the information reached Princess Anne. Unlike many others, Anne reportedly did not react with confusion or hesitation. Through trusted royal channels, she learned details that immediately raised concerns. Those who know Anne often describe her as one of the monarchy's most steadfast defenders, someone whose loyalty to duty rarely wavers. To her, this was never merely a legal matter. It was a question of principle. Charles had spent a lifetime serving the institution, and if his final intentions were now under threat, Anne believed she had a responsibility to act. What followed was a series of urgent discussions involving some of the most influential figures connected to the royal household. Phones rang late into the evening. Private consultations multiplied. Long-standing relationships were tested as individuals quietly assessed where their loyalties truly belonged. At the same time, another troubling mystery emerged. If a challenge of this magnitude had reached such an advanced stage, who had helped make it possible? Questions began circulating about potential allies, confidential conversations, and the identities of those working behind the scenes. Every answer seemed to reveal another layer of uncertainty, another hidden connection, another reason for concern. As Anne examined each piece of information, her suspicions only deepened. What initially appeared to be an isolated disagreement was beginning to resemble something much larger, a conflict capable of reshaping relationships throughout the monarchy. The stakes were growing with every passing day, and the consequences of failure seemed impossible to ignore. Because if Charles' legacy was now being questioned, then the battle ahead would not simply determine the fate of a document. It would determine who ultimately controlled the story of his reign. But the deeper Anne investigated, the more she realized this wasn't simply a legal dispute, it was the beginning of a battle over Charles' legacy itself. For years, whispers surrounded the contents of Charles's most protected documents. Few knew exactly what he wanted preserved after his reign, and even fewer understood how carefully those wishes had been guarded. Yet hidden within those pages were decisions powerful enough to reshape royal relationships, redistribute influence, and determine who would truly control the future of the crown. And once Anne saw what was at stake, there was no turning back. The more Princess Anne uncovered, the more she realized that the battle unfolding behind palace walls was far larger than anyone had initially believed. What had first appeared to be a challenge aimed at a single legal document was gradually revealing itself as a struggle over the future identity of the monarchy itself. At the center of that struggle stood the final wishes of King Charles, preserved within documents that had remained protected for years. Very few people had ever been allowed close enough to understand their full significance. Fewer still knew how much thought, caution, and personal conviction Charles had reportedly invested in every detail they contained. According to those familiar with the matter, Charles spent years refining instructions that he believed would guide the monarchy long after his own chapter had ended. These were not rushed decisions or temporary solutions. They were carefully considered choices shaped by decades of experience, triumphs, disappointments, and lessons learned during some of the most turbulent periods in modern royal history. Every clause allegedly reflected a larger vision. Every provision carried meaning. And as Anne examined the situation, she became increasingly convinced that what was being challenged was not merely paperwork but the culmination of Charles' life's work. What made the situation even more explosive were reports that certain provisions within those documents reduced future authority for specific individuals and redistributed influence in ways few had anticipated. While supporters viewed those decisions as necessary safeguards designed to protect the institution, critics allegedly saw them as restrictions capable of reshaping the balance of power for years to come. The result was a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, private frustrations and old tensions appeared connected to something much larger. The will was no longer being viewed as a personal matter. It had become a symbol of Charles' vision for the monarchy's future. Palace insiders reportedly described the documents as unusually detailed, leaving little room for uncertainty regarding Charles's intentions. That level of precision only intensified the stakes. If those wishes could somehow be challenged, altered, or weakened, the consequences could ripple through every corner of royal life. Advisors began quietly discussing possibilities they had hoped never to confront. Questions multiplied. What would happen if even a small portion of Charles's plans were overturned? Could a legal challenge create precedents that extended far beyond the immediate dispute? And perhaps most troubling of all, could the controversy spill into public view and damage the institution itself? For Anne, these concerns were deeply personal. Throughout her life, she had developed a reputation for loyalty, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to duty. Those qualities now pushed her forward with renewed determination. Sources claimed that she increasingly viewed herself as the guardian of Charles's final legacy, someone responsible for ensuring that his wishes remained intact, regardless of pressure or opposition. The issue was no longer political, it was emotional. Memories of years spent supporting her brother strengthened her resolve. Every new discovery reinforced her belief that protecting those documents meant protecting the future he had spent a lifetime trying to build. As discussions intensified, fears of a public scandal grew stronger. Senior advisors reportedly warned that even partial success by those seeking changes could trigger confusion, division, and damaging speculation. What appeared to be a legal disagreement could quickly evolve into a crisis capable of altering royal power structures in ways nobody could fully predict. The atmosphere became increasingly tense as competing interests collided behind closed doors. Yet even as Anne focused every effort on protecting the document she believed represented Charles' final vision, another question haunted palace corridors: why had Camilla decided to act now? Timing is everything in royal politics. And according to insiders, Camilla's challenge wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was the result of months of frustration, private disagreements, and growing fears about her place in the monarchy's future. What began as quiet concern allegedly evolved into a bold legal strategy. But with every move she made, she unknowingly pushed Princess Anne closer to a confrontation neither woman could avoid. The question that had begun to echo through palace corridors now demanded an answer. Why now? Why would Camilla choose this particular moment to challenge arrangements that had supposedly been settled long ago? As Princess Anne continued examining the growing controversy, she reportedly discovered that the roots of the dispute stretched much deeper than anyone had first imagined. This was not simply a disagreement triggered by a single document. It was the culmination of months of uncertainty, private frustrations, and fears that had quietly intensified beneath the surface, while the rest of the world remained unaware. According to insiders, one of the driving forces behind Camilla's actions was a growing concern about her future role and influence within the monarchy after Charles. While she had spent years standing beside him, supporting him through moments of triumph and crisis alike, questions about what would come next allegedly became increasingly difficult to ignore. Sources claimed that as discussions surrounding long-term royal arrangements became more detailed, Camilla began to fear that her future position might be more limited than she had expected. Whether those fears were justified or not, they reportedly became impossible for her to dismiss. Those concerns did not develop in isolation. Trusted allies and advisors allegedly encouraged her to seek clarification regarding the provisions that directly affected her future. What began as private conversations soon evolved into something more organized. Individuals close to the situation reportedly argued that unanswered questions could create uncertainty later, and that seeking legal guidance was both reasonable and necessary. Yet every step taken toward clarification seemed to pull the situation further away from compromise and closer to confrontation. As the stakes increased, a series of private meetings allegedly took place beyond the reach of normal palace scrutiny. Discussions remained confidential. Strategies were considered. Options were explored. The deeper these conversations progressed, the more difficult it became to keep the growing tension contained. Rumors spread among senior staff, and soon the royal household itself appeared divided. Some believed the challenge was a legitimate attempt to protect future interests. Others viewed it as a dangerous move capable of undermining carefully established plans. That division created an atmosphere of uncertainty unlike anything seen in years. Advisors who normally worked together reportedly found themselves on opposing sides of the debate. Some urged caution, believing negotiation offered the best path forward. They feared that escalation would create unnecessary damage and potentially expose private disagreements to public scrutiny. Others argued that the issues involved were too significant to ignore. With powerful interests colliding behind closed doors, consensus became increasingly difficult to achieve. For Anne, however, the situation looked very different. Every new detail strengthened her belief that the challenge threatened the stability Charles had spent years trying to secure. She reportedly viewed the effort not as a request for clarification, but as a direct challenge to carefully established intentions. The possibility that legal disputes could interfere with Charles' vision for the future deeply troubled her. What others saw as negotiation, Anne increasingly interpreted as a risk to the monarchy itself. As tensions spread throughout royal households, old wounds and long-standing disagreements began resurfacing. Relationships that had appeared stable suddenly felt strained. Conversations grew more cautious. Trust became harder to find. Beneath the legal arguments lay years of personal history, competing loyalties, and unresolved frustrations. What had started as a dispute over influence was evolving into something far more emotional and far more dangerous. With each passing day, the gap between the two sides widened. Positions became firmer. Compromise became less likely. Supporters quietly chose where they stood, while uncertainty gave way to determination. And as the pressure intensified behind palace walls, one thing became increasingly clear. This conflict was moving toward a decisive turning point from which neither side could retreat. As positions hardened and loyalties shifted, Anne prepared a response that would transform a private disagreement into a royal showdown. Few royals command respect quite like Princess Anne. Known for her discipline, loyalty, and refusal to bend under pressure, she has spent decades protecting the institution above personal interests. So when she concluded that Charles's wishes were under threat, she reportedly made a decision that stunned everyone around her. For Anne, this was no longer about personalities, it was about duty, and duty came first. As the divide inside royal circles grew deeper, Anne reached a conclusion that would change the course of the entire conflict. For weeks, she had watched concerns evolve into tensions, and tensions evolve into open disagreements. What had once been a private matter discussed quietly among advisors was now threatening to become a defining struggle over the future direction of the monarchy. According to insiders, Anne believed the situation had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. If she intended to protect what Charles had carefully established, she would have to act, and she would have to act immediately. Those familiar with the unfolding events claim that Anne began assembling a small circle of trusted legal and constitutional advisors, individuals whose experience and discretion she valued above all else. These were not people chosen for convenience or politics. They were selected because Anne needed certainty in a situation clouded by competing interpretations and growing speculation. Every opinion mattered. Every detail mattered. The challenge facing her was no longer confined to personal disagreements. It had become a question of preserving the integrity of decisions Charles had spent years shaping. Unlike others who relied on summaries and second-hand reports, Anne reportedly insisted on examining every available detail herself. Sources suggested she spent countless hours reviewing information, questioning assumptions, and searching for weaknesses that could threaten Charles' intentions. The deeper she looked, the more convinced she became that the stakes extended far beyond the immediate dispute. If one challenge succeeded, others could follow. If one carefully protected decision could be weakened, future decisions might become vulnerable as well. That realization transformed concern into determination. Palace insiders described her response as both immediate and decisive. There was no dramatic announcement and no public declaration. Instead, Anne moved with the quiet precision that had defined much of her life. Conversations were initiated, advice was sought. Strategic plans began taking shape behind closed doors. While others debated possibilities, Anne focused on action. Her objective was clear. She intended to build a defense strong enough to protect Charles' legacy before the challenge gained irreversible momentum. At the same time, she reportedly reached out to key establishment figures whose influence extended far beyond palace walls. Some had worked closely with the monarchy for years. Others understood the constitutional implications of what was unfolding. Many shared concerns about the consequences of prolonged conflict. As these discussions progressed, support for Anne's position quietly began to grow. Influential voices who initially remained neutral gradually aligned themselves with the belief that Charles's wishes deserved protection. Their backing did not end the dispute, but it strengthened Anne's position at a critical moment. Yet growing support brought new risks. Anxiety about potential public fallout intensified. Advisors warned that if details of the conflict became widely known, the monarchy could face a wave of damaging speculation. The institution's reputation depended heavily on stability, and stability was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every leak, every rumor, and every whispered conversation carried the potential to escalate the situation further. What had begun as a legal disagreement was now attracting concerns about the monarchy's credibility itself. Meanwhile, Pressure quietly mounted on Camilla's camp. Questions became harder to answer. Confidence appeared less certain. The growing coalition supporting Anne forced many observers to reconsider the challenge's chances of success. Yet the dispute was no longer simply about documents, influence, or competing interpretations. It was evolving into something much larger, a battle over legitimacy, authority, and who truly held the right to define Charles's enduring legacy. As alliances solidified and tensions reached new heights, Anne understood that support alone would not guarantee victory. Time was becoming her greatest enemy. Every day allowed the challenge to gather strength, attract attention, and create new complications. The next phase would require more than preparation. It would require decisive action before events moved beyond anyone's control. But Anne's intervention would only matter if she could stop the challenge before it gained momentum, and the clock was already ticking. What followed wasn't a public courtroom spectacle. Instead, it became a hidden war fought through confidential meetings, legal arguments, private consultations, and strategic pressure. Behind palace doors, two competing visions of Charles' legacy collided. Every conversation carried consequences. Every document mattered. And with each passing day, the possibility of a royal rupture grew more dangerous. As the pressure intensified, the conflict entered an entirely new phase. The debate was no longer centered on whether the challenge existed. That question had already been answered. The real battle now focused on whether the challenge could survive the growing resistance gathering around Princess Anne. According to insiders, the atmosphere inside royal circles became increasingly tense as advisors, legal experts, and influential figures quietly took their positions. What had started as a private disagreement was evolving into a carefully fought campaign where every move was calculated and every mistake could prove costly. Anne's team reportedly began by examining the very foundation of the challenge itself. Rather than reacting emotionally, they focused on dismantling the arguments supporting it piece by piece. Sources claimed that trusted advisors scrutinized every detail, searching for weaknesses, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities. Their objective was not merely to defend Charles's wishes, but to establish that those wishes had been created with such precision and clarity that any challenge would face overwhelming obstacles. It was a strategy built on patience, preparation, and relentless attention to detail. At the same time, confidential consultations intensified across multiple levels of the royal establishment. Conversations stretched late into the evening. Opinions were requested from individuals who rarely involved themselves in disputes of this nature. Every participant understood the stakes. If Charles's final arrangements could be successfully challenged, the consequences might extend far beyond a single document. The issue threatened to redefine how future royal decisions could be interpreted, contested, and potentially overturned. Yet as more voices entered the discussion, competing interpretations of Charles's intentions began to emerge. Some argued that his wishes were unmistakably clear and should remain untouched. Others suggested that certain provisions left room for questions that deserved examination. The disagreement created uncertainty, and uncertainty became fertile ground for further conflict. What one side considered protection of a legacy, the other viewed as necessary clarification. That divide only deepened existing tensions. Concerned by the growing hostility, several senior figures reportedly attempted to broker some form of mediation. Their hope was simple: prevent a private dispute from becoming a lasting fracture within the monarchy. Efforts were made to encourage dialogue. Compromise was quietly explored. For a brief moment, there appeared to be a possibility that the conflict might be contained before lasting damage occurred. But emotions were already running too high, and the issues involved had become too significant for easy solutions. As negotiations struggled to gain traction, palace factions became increasingly visible. People who had once remained neutral found themselves forced to choose where they stood. Quiet loyalties emerged. Long-standing relationships were tested. Every new development seemed to strengthen divisions rather than heal them. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day, as uncertainty spread throughout royal households. Meanwhile, another fear began overshadowing everything else: the possibility of a public leak. Advisors on all sides reportedly understood that if sensitive details reached the public, the fallout could be devastating. The monarchy's image depended heavily on unity and stability. A prolonged public dispute involving Charles' legacy risked creating headlines capable of overshadowing everything else. That fear intensified the urgency surrounding every decision being made behind closed doors. Rather than retreating under pressure, Anne reportedly became even more determined. The more resistance she encountered, the more convinced she became that protecting Charles's intentions was essential. Her efforts grew more focused. Her support base grew stronger. Gradually, insiders began noticing a shift. Momentum that had once appeared to favor Camilla's challenge was beginning to move in another direction. Confidence inside Anne's camp increased, while uncertainty started creeping into the opposing side. Still, nobody involved believed the battle was over. The situation remained fragile, unpredictable, and capable of changing without warning. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a feeling was beginning to emerge that the conflict was approaching a decisive moment. Few realized just how close that moment truly was. Then came the moment insiders describe as the turning point, the event that changed everything overnight. Just when the dispute appeared evenly balanced, a revelation reportedly surfaced that altered the entire landscape. Suddenly, assumptions were challenged, alliances were tested, and confidence inside Camilla's camp began to falter. What emerged wasn't merely another legal detail, it was evidence that struck at the very heart of the argument itself, leaving everyone wondering how the battle could continue. For weeks, the conflict had moved forward with neither side willing to retreat. Advisors debated, loyalties shifted, and uncertainty hung over every private conversation. Yet despite all the tension, many insiders still believed the outcome remained impossible to predict. The challenge was alive. Supporters on both sides remained determined. The balance appeared fragile but intact. Then everything changed. According to sources familiar with the situation, information emerged that few had anticipated and even fewer were prepared to confront. What began as a rumor quickly developed into something far more significant, triggering a chain reaction that spread through royal circles with astonishing speed. The details of the revelation remained closely guarded, but insiders claimed it involved previously unknown information connected directly to Charles's intentions. For months, competing interpretations had fueled the dispute. Both sides believed they understood what Charles had wanted. Both sides argued that their position reflected his vision for the monarchy. Yet this new development allegedly challenged many of the assumptions that had sustained the conflict from the beginning. Suddenly, questions that once seemed settled were reopened, and confidence that had appeared unshakable began to crack. The impact was immediate. Advisors who had firmly supported one interpretation reportedly found themselves reassessing their positions. Conversations that had once felt predictable became uncertain. Long-held arguments were scrutinized with renewed intensity. Individuals who previously viewed the challenge as reasonable began asking difficult questions. Had critical information been overlooked? Had certain conclusions been reached too quickly? And most importantly, did this new evidence reveal a clearer understanding of Charles' true intentions than anyone had possessed before? For Anne, the shift was impossible to ignore. Those close to her claimed that the revelation strengthened her conviction more than ever. The determination she had displayed throughout the conflict suddenly seemed backed by something far more powerful than instinct or loyalty. It appeared supported by facts that could not easily be dismissed. After weeks of relentless pressure, she reportedly sensed that the tide was beginning to turn. Not because the battle was over, but because the foundation beneath the challenge itself was starting to weaken. Inside Camilla's camp, however, the atmosphere allegedly became far more complicated. Supporters who had once spoken with confidence were now divided over how to proceed. Some remained committed to the challenge, arguing that unanswered questions still deserved examination. Others worried that continuing the fight in light of the new information could create unnecessary risks. What had once been a united effort gradually became a debate over strategy, timing, and whether the challenge could survive the growing doubts surrounding it. Behind closed doors, palace discussions intensified to levels not seen since the controversy began. Meetings multiplied. Consultations expanded. Every participant understood that the conflict had entered a critical phase. The revelation did not end the dispute overnight, but it forced everyone involved to reconsider their assumptions. More importantly, it reportedly made Charles's intentions appear clearer than they had at any previous stage of the battle. The ambiguity that once fueled disagreement seemed to be fading. As clarity increased, support for the challenge began eroding. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily enough to become impossible to ignore. Key figures who had remained undecided started leaning toward Anne's position. Others quietly stepped back from active involvement altogether. Momentum that had already been shifting now accelerated, creating growing concern among those who had hoped the challenge would succeed. Yet victory brought no celebration. Anne understood that legal success would not erase the damage already done. Relationships had been strained. Trust had been tested. Emotions that had remained buried for years were now surfacing with unexpected force. And while the legal tide appeared to be turning in her favor, a different storm was beginning to gather beneath the surface. Yet even as the legal tide shifted, the emotional consequences inside the family were only beginning to surface. Legal disputes can be settled. Family wounds are far harder to heal. As the conflict deepened, relationships inside the royal circle reportedly became strained in ways few outsiders could imagine. Conversations stopped, trust eroded. Long-standing tensions resurfaced. What began as a disagreement over a document had evolved into something much more painful, a struggle over loyalty, memory, and the future of the family itself. Even as Anne's position appeared to strengthen and support for the challenge continued to weaken, the victory came at a heavy cost. The legal arguments that had dominated discussions for weeks were gradually being replaced by something far more emotional. Beneath every debate about documents, authority, and royal protocol lay a deeper conflict that could not be resolved through consultation or legal interpretation. Families carry memories, grievances, disappointments, and loyalties that often remain hidden until moments of crisis bring them to the surface. According to insiders, that was exactly what began happening behind palace walls. The pressure reportedly forced family members into an uncomfortable position. Many who had hoped to remain neutral found themselves facing impossible choices. Silence itself became a statement. Every conversation seemed loaded with meaning. Every decision was scrutinized. Some relatives allegedly sympathized with Anne's determination to protect Charles' final wishes. Others privately understood Camilla's concerns about her future role and influence. The result was a growing sense that no matter what anyone chose, someone else would feel betrayed. As divisions deepened, emotional fractures became increasingly difficult to hide. Long-standing relationships that had survived previous controversies suddenly appeared strained. Trust, once assumed, became uncertain. Conversations reportedly grew shorter. Private discussions became more guarded. Individuals who had spent years working together found themselves separated by conflicting loyalties. What made the situation particularly painful was that nobody seemed capable of stepping away from it. Charles's legacy touched every corner of the family, making neutrality nearly impossible. At the center of the storm stood Princess Anne. Although support for her position had increased significantly, sources claimed she often found herself carrying the burden largely alone. Duty had always defined her approach to royal life, but duty can be isolating. Every step she took attracted scrutiny. Every decision invited criticism. Yet despite the pressure, Anne reportedly refused to retreat. The more emotionally difficult the conflict became, the more determined she appeared. Those closest to her claimed she believed she was defending something larger than herself. She was defending the final wishes of a brother she had supported for decades. Meanwhile, Camilla faced growing criticism from multiple directions. Questions that once focused solely on legal matters became increasingly personal. Critics allegedly began challenging her motivations, while supporters struggled to defend decisions that were now being examined through an emotional lens. The pressure intensified with every passing day. What had started as a strategic challenge had transformed into a deeply personal controversy capable of reshaping reputations and relationships alike. The conflict also revived memories of older disagreements that many believed had been left in the past. Historical grievances resurfaced unexpectedly. Previous tensions were revisited. Old misunderstandings found new relevance. As a result, discussions rarely remained focused on the present. Instead, they became tangled with years of accumulated emotions and unresolved frustrations. The dispute was no longer simply about what Charles wanted. It was about how different members of the family interpreted their place within his story. Throughout it all, one theme dominated every private conversation: loyalty. Loyalty to Charles. Loyalty to the institution. Loyalty to family. Each person defined it differently, and those differing definitions became the source of endless disagreement. Charles's memory, once a unifying force, now sat at the center of every argument. Ironically, everyone claimed to be protecting his legacy, yet those competing efforts were pulling the family further apart. Beyond the emotional damage, concerns about the monarchy's public image grew stronger. Advisors feared that if the depth of the divisions became widely known, confidence in the institution could suffer. Stability had always been one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. Now that stability appeared increasingly fragile. Yet even as emotions reached their highest point and relationships faced unprecedented strain, events were already moving toward a final resolution. And just when it seemed the conflict had reached its peak, one final decision would bring the entire battle to a dramatic conclusion. After weeks of mounting pressure, secret negotiations, and escalating royal tension, the battle reportedly reached its final chapter. What happened next stunned observers and left insiders, describing the outcome as one of the most significant behind-the-scenes royal victories in recent memory. Princess Anne had stepped forward as protector of Charles's final wishes, and now the monarchy faced a future forever shaped by the stand she chose to take. The final days of the conflict carried a sense of inevitability that few could ignore. For weeks, uncertainty had dominated every discussion. Advisors had argued, loyalties had shifted, relationships had been tested. Yet despite all the tension, the outcome remained uncertain until the very end. Then, according to insiders, a decisive development brought the long-running struggle to its conclusion. The legal challenge that had threatened to reopen one of the most sensitive chapters in Charles' legacy reportedly lost the momentum necessary to continue. What once appeared capable of reshaping the monarchy's future suddenly found itself facing insurmountable resistance. The battle that had consumed royal circles for weeks was finally coming to an end. Sources claimed that as support continued to erode, efforts to sustain the challenge became increasingly difficult. Advisors who had once argued passionately for further action reportedly began acknowledging the realities of the situation. The combination of mounting scrutiny, growing opposition, and the emergence of information that strengthened Anne's position proved impossible to ignore. Gradually, the challenge stalled. Then, it stopped altogether. For many observers within royal circles, the outcome represented more than a legal defeat. It symbolized the preservation of Charles' final vision and the triumph of those determined to protect it. At the center of that victory stood Princess Anne. Throughout the conflict, she had faced pressure from multiple directions. She had endured criticism, navigated complex loyalties, and accepted the personal cost of taking a firm position. Yet she never retreated. According to those close to the situation, Anne viewed the dispute as a matter of duty rather than personal preference. Her determination was rooted in a belief that Charles's wishes deserved protection regardless of the political consequences. When the challenge finally collapsed, many inside the royal establishment reportedly saw Anne not simply as the winner of a dispute, but as the defender of Charles's legacy itself. The immediate result was a temporary restoration of stability. After weeks of tension, uncertainty, and speculation, the monarchy finally gained a brief opportunity to breathe. Conversations that had once been dominated by conflict shifted toward rebuilding trust and restoring unity. Senior figures reportedly expressed relief that a potentially damaging confrontation had been avoided. The institution, which had appeared vulnerable to prolonged internal division, seemed to regain its footing. For a moment, the threat of deeper instability receded into the background. Support for Anne also grew significantly. Individuals who had remained cautious during the conflict increasingly praised her resolve and commitment. Her reputation for discipline and loyalty, already well established, emerged stronger than before. Many believed she had stepped into one of the most difficult situations imaginable and refused to compromise when it mattered most. That perception only strengthened her standing across royal circles and reinforced the respect she had earned over decades of service. Most importantly, Charles's wishes reportedly remained intact. The vision he had spent years refining survived the challenge and continued to shape the future he had envisioned. For Anne and her supporters, that outcome represented the true victory. Yet even as one battle ended, new questions began emerging. The conflict had exposed vulnerabilities that could not easily be forgotten. It had revealed how quickly disagreements could escalate and how fragile unity could become under pressure. For Camilla, the aftermath brought significant changes. While she remained an important figure within the monarchy, the controversy reportedly altered perceptions in ways that would be difficult to reverse. Critics became more vocal. Supporters became more cautious. Her position inside the royal structure appeared different than it had before the dispute began. The consequences were not immediate or dramatic, but they were unmistakable. And despite the restoration of stability, emotional scars remained. Families remember conflicts long after legal disputes are settled. Trust takes time to rebuild. Relationships require healing. The people involved would carry the memories of this battle long after headlines faded and public attention moved elsewhere. The monarchy itself entered a new chapter, one shaped by lessons learned during one of its most difficult internal struggles. Because while this battle may be over, insiders believe the struggle over Charles's legacy, and who ultimately shapes the monarchy's future, is only just beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.